Good Moyed. And we're learning Likkutei Sichot, Volume 1, the Sichot for Acharei Mos. And it's important to know that by our brothers in Chutz La'aretz, they're not reading Acharei Mos this Shabbos. They're reading, it's still Yontiv. They will be reading in Kesef, or I don't remember which one, in Kesef Talvei Tami again, or I don't remember what they learn. And then they have the Haftarah, which is the most important Haftarah of the year, which in Eretz Yisrael we never read. Od Hayom Benov La'amod, chapter 10 in Isaiah, chapters 10 and 11 actually. And that Haftarah is the basis for why we do Sudas Mashiach on the 8th day of Pesach. So here in Eretz Yisrael, nobody reads that Haftarah. So it's very interesting that the rabbinate, the chief rabbinate in Israel, they decided that on Yom HaAtzmaut this would be the Haftarah. It's a very interesting decision. First of all, because it's the complete opposite of the state of Israel, completely the opposite. It can't be more opposite than that. But I think they did it because they recognized it was such important Haftarah that nobody ever reads here. So they decided to, do it as quickly as they could. So there's a few days after 7th day of Pesach, usually a week after, a week and a half after. So you have this thing called Yom HaAtzmaut, the Independence Day, and they decided they would read in the Torah and have laning and have they lane, and then they say the Haftarah. And the Haftarah they chose is Od Hayom Benov La'amod. What I'm not sure is whether they say the whole Haftarah, because it's relatively long. And the most important part is the end. And that's where we got the whole Sudas Mashiach thing, from the splitting of the river into 7 parts by the Mashiach in the future, which represents the opening up of the well springs above, and the revelation of godliness within Torah. And really what that means is Chassidus. That's why Chassidus makes such a big deal out of this Haftarah, out of this idea that in the same way that when we came out of Egypt, God split the ocean, the sea open, so that we would see that He is the one who controls nature. So too, the consciousness of the Torah will be opened, and so that you see godliness in every word that you read. And that's what Chassidus does, basically. When people say, what does it mean to see godliness? When you're reading a text, seeing godliness is not that the letters are going to jump out at you and say, I'm godly. They're not going to say anything. Rather, it's that you read it in such a way that right away, like we learned in Chassidus, the whole way the Chassidus is learned is that everything is indicating something about godliness. And you become conscious of godliness through what you learn. Okay. La Pasuk, in any case, we here in Eretz Yisrael don't read all that. We don't have all those good times. So we're stuck with Acharei Mos. And Acharei, Parshas Acharei, לפסוק ושמרתם את משמרתי, נאמר בגמרא, עשו משמרת למשמרתי, right? So we learn from this a very important concept in Yevamos, was just learned in Daf Yomi about 3 weeks ago, I think, that you need to make a fence to the fence. I mean, you need to make a second level of warning, so that people don't transgress. Kan yesodam shel hagdarim v'hasyagim derabanan. And from this we learn the basis for why the sages make all kinds of safety nets around the Torah. וגם של הגדרים והשגים שכל יהודי חייב לגדור עצמו בהם, אפילו ביחס לדברים מותרים, כדי לא לבוא חס וחלילה על ידי איסור. But people forget that this is not just an injunction upon the sages to make these fences around the Torah. It's what every individual, it's said, Ushmartem et mishmarti, it's said in the plural, but it's also including the individual. Every person has to think about what things he needs in his life to draw a fence around. Even those things that are permitted. For instance, if a person has a problem with ice cream, so he puts a fence around the ice cream. He says, whenever I walk in the supermarket, the last place I will go and won't go near is the ice cream fridge or freezer.
But I say my wife.
And that also you need to make a fence to a fence, which means that you can't send your wife either. כאמור, בספרי מוסר שיש להישמר ממאה שערים של היתר כדי לא להגיע לשער של איסור. As it says in books of Musar, it doesn't say which one, books of ethics, that one should be careful of 100 gates of permissible things, meaning 100 entrances that are you're allowed to enter, in order not to end up going through the 101st, which is something that's forbidden. So if the gates are all the same, you have to be careful. You can't even start with the first one. מצויים כאלה הטועים וטוענים לשם מה יש לחפש חומרות חדשות. So it's interesting, coming out of Pesach, talking about chumras. So there are those who make a mistake and they claim, why do you need to be more stringent? And stringent in ways that we don't find them in the past. For instance, not eating dairy on Pesach. Okay. אם ביחס לדברים שנאסרו על ידי רבותינו של דור נאמר לא תעשו מן הדבר אשר הרגילו לך, וגם בהם אין לדקדק יותר מדי, שכן אינם אלה דרבנן. אבל חומרות חדשות ודאי שאין לחפש, דייך מה שאסרה לך התורה. When it comes to the fences that the previous generations of sages put up around the Torah, so there we have another mitzvah called לא תסור וכל אשר יורוך. You're not allowed to deviate from whatever they tell you, left or right. So there we're performing something that we're obligated to. Because the Torah says not to deviate from something that a previous generation decreed. But why should we make new ones? New stringencies, new fences. ומביאים הם ההוכחה לדברים מן האמור בירושלמי שאדם יידרש למסור דין וחשבון כל דבר מאכל שראה ולא אכל ממנו. They usually bring a proof for this. You're not allowed to refrain from things that are permissible. Because the Yerushalmi says that in the future, whatever apple a person didn't eat because of being too stringent, he had some kind of chumrah that he had, that he didn't want to eat this. This apple will come and prosecute him in the world to come, and he'll be prosecuted for not eating it. Why did you prevent yourself from a pleasure that's permissible? Furthermore, they claim, מאחר שביצוע הכל קשה מאוד, לא כדאי להרבות בחומרות והידורים, בגללם עלול לאדם חסרי להפסיד את העיקר. Because everything is so difficult as it is, Torah is not easy to perform. There's many mitzvot, there's many things that are prohibited. So why would you want to add more fences, more stringencies, and solely people focus on these and they lose the main objective? For instance, this happens to people in Pesach. In Pesach there's a mitzvah to be happy. What if a person is mamish suffering from not having coffee? Yeah. Can you tell them to have coffee that's 100%, but that's Eidah Charedis, kasher lePesach? But we don't have it unless we made it beforehand. We make some kind of a tamtzit, some kind of we basically take the instant coffee, we make it into liquid, and then we have it. But in our case, I don't drink coffee at all. I only drink water, so I don't have this problem. I don't have a headache when Pesach comes around. But my wife has been suffering from a terrible headache for the last 2 days. Why? Because the little jug she made that had enough coffee there for 8 days spilled. There's no coffee left. So it's really debating this. It's not easy. Are you allowed to suffer now for 3-4 days? In the end, it passes. Or just make coffee. What's the big deal? It's kosher anyway. Because we have this extra stringency and this and that. It's a big question. So are you not losing the main aspect of what Pesach is about? Well, on Shabbos you won't have a problem. But probably the headache will be gone by then. Right? It's a headache. It's a coffee headache. It's when you're deprived of what the body's used to, it usually causes a headache. So it's a big question. It's not easy. הם מביאים הוכחה לכך מחטא עץ הדת, שורש כל החטאים, שכתוצאה מתוספת איסור שקדוש ברוך הוא לא ציווה, לא תיגעו בו נוסף ולא תאכלו ממנו, יצא החטא. So one of the best proofs for this, that you should not add new fences, and because of that you might lose. The main thing is when they ate from the tree of knowledge. What was the reason for that? Because Eve said, we were forbidden from touching it, which was not true. She just added that, or Adam added it for her. Whatever it wasn't part of the actual prohibition. And because of that, they came to eat from the tree itself. And that was definitely forbidden. So adding a new fence is not always a good idea. But he says, no, there's a big mistake here. There's an error in the judgment here. Everything was given from one shepherd. What does this mean? Everything is given equally from Hashem. Because there is a foundation in the Torah for the sages making a fence around the Torah, lo tasur, and the thing that we just said about you should not deviate from what they've instructed you left or right. Even the edicts and the decrees made by the sages have the same legitimacy, the same strength as a prohibition from the Torah. It's like a Doraisa. הבדלי ההלכות בין דאורייתא ובין דרבנן הם מפני שכך רוצה התורה, שבדאורייתא יהיה הספק לחומרה, ובדרבנן ספקו להקל וכדומה. The reason that the Torah made it, or the reason God differentiated between decrees that come from the sages and decrees or obligations or prohibitions that come from the Torah, is because there are some differences between them in terms of safek, in terms of when you have doubt. And again, those doubts are only in Isra V'Heter. For instance, in Mamonot, it doesn't hold. In Nefeshot, it also doesn't hold. In certain areas of mitzvot, if there's a doubt, if it came from the sages, if the prohibition came from the sages, we are more lenient. And if there's a doubt, but the prohibition came from the Torah itself, we're more stringent. כך גם ביחס לחובה מוטל לכל אחד לגדור עצמו בדברים ומותרים, שכן גם זה ציווי התורה ושמרתם את משמרתי. In the same way, these fences that we're required to put up, even in the things that are permissible, okay, those two have the same validity, the same foundation as a mitzvah d'oraisa, as something that came from the Torah itself. נוסף למצוות עשה של קדושים תהיו והתקדשתם, כדי שנצלחה בה מותר לך, נכלל דבר גם בשמרתם את משמרתי, עשו משמרת למשמרתי. He says there's two sources for this. The one is that we mentioned in the beginning, that you should safekeep my safekeeping, meaning that you should make a fence around the fence. And the second, which is in our Parsha, in Parsha Acharei. And the second one is that, which we say, in Parshas Kedoshim, Kedoshim tiyu v'itkadishtem. You should be holy. To be holy means kadesh atzmecha b'mutar lecha. You should sanctify yourself through those things that are permissible. Meaning, sanctity is not by preventing myself from doing something that's prohibited. That's not sanctity. Sanctity is when there is something that's permissible, and because I know that this is a problem for me, this thing that's permissible, it causes me to fall into things that I shouldn't, then I have an obligation to make a fence around them, and that's what it means to be holy. What about those two arguments that we bought from the Yerushalmi, that the apple that you didn't eat is going to come prosecute you, and the example of Eve adding something and then failing to do what was required? האדם הראשון בהיותו בגן עדן היה מרכבה לאלוקות והיה לו כל מגע עם הרע. Adam in the Garden of Eden had no need for fences. Why? Because he was a complete chariot to the divine will. There was no Yetzer Hara yet. There was no even an inclination in himself yet. It wasn't inside of him, because that's what we say. that when they ate from the tree of knowledge, then the snake became part of them. It was awakened within them. And the Rambam dedicates chapter 2 of Mor Nevuchim for a very Guide to the Perplexed with a very interesting explanation about this. וראיה לדבר מכך שגן עדן אינו סובל את מציאות הרע, ולפיכך לא היה ביכולתו להישאר לאחר החטא בגן עדן. And the reason that he was kicked out, he was exiled from the Garden of Eden after he ate from the tree of knowledge, is because the Garden of Eden cannot tolerate anything negative. So Adam cannot be tolerated within the Garden of Eden anymore. So that's another sign that there's no evil in the garden itself. It can't tolerate it. Of course, now someone would ask, so what about the serpent, the snake? It was there. He doesn't answer this question.
Well, the serpent may not be necessarily evil. He must have been just trying to test mankind.
Could be.
Hoping that he would
Could be.
fail.
That's a possible answer. Merkava, kol ma'asem b'ratzon harochev. When you're a chariot, you're like a chariot. The only thing you can do is move based on where your driver takes you. ולפיכך אין מקום לגדרים וסייגים, משום שאין חשש של כישלון. And because there's no evil, there was no need for any fences, because there was no need to segregate yourself from anything that could lead to a failure. ואדרבה, לא זו בלבד שהגדרים והסייגים מיותרים, הם אף מהווים חיסרון. Not only that, as we said, that there where there's no evil, to add a fence around something that you don't need, that's what it means. You added a fence that you don't need it. Again, there's no need for it, because you have no evil inclination. There's no way you will fail anyway. So that becomes a problem. When you add things that you don't need, that really is an issue. שכן זה שהוא בבחינת מרכבה לאלוקות וכל עשייותיו קדושה, בשעה שהוא עוסק בעניין, הרי מרומם אותו, וכך שהוא נמנע מלעשות דבר ומונע את התעלותו, דוגמת אכילת קודשים, אכילת שבת וכו'. במקום שיש צורך בגדרים וסייגים, הם מהווים יתרון. So there they didn't need the fences, and that's why what caused Eve and Adam to sin by eating from the tree of knowledge. It's true, because they didn't need that fence of saying we're not allowed to touch it. There's simply no need for it. And then you get into trouble when you do this. But, and you get into trouble in the sense also that if you were supposed to eat something and you didn't enjoy it, because what was it there for in the first place? God created it for the enjoyment of a person. So then you're liable to be prosecuted by that food that you didn't eat. But that's, again, only in cases where there is an issue, that there's some kind of evil inclination that might come out because they did something permissible. I come closer to something that's prohibited. Okay. But in the Garden of Eden, there's no such case, and therefore, when there is a need for these fences, they are a mitzvah. They're a mitzvah like any other mitzvah in the Torah. They have the same power. They have the same gravity. They have the same legitimacy. But where they're not needed, yes, it's unpermissible. It's not permissible to add a fence that you don't need. So it's all dependent on whether you need the fence or you don't. Okay.
Okay.
So what is this? That's definitely achna. It's definitely submission. So it's very short for Acharei Mot. So it works out well for us here in Israel, because that's it. On Shabbos we'll read Acharei Mot.
To America, you have to catch up your language.
I can't catch up.
Right?
Because I'll be a week behind. I lose a parsha.
There's minyanim here.
There's no minyanim every week. So it's not that simple.
So when are you going on a Monday?
Hopefully. Monday night, very late.
You're coming back?
And Thursday. Thursday the week after.
In the middle of the day, also very late.
Yeah.
Wait.
What?
In the middle of the day or very late?
No, very late.
So we lose